What is going on, everyone? Welcome back to the Actually Good Coffee podcast, the show where I've had to record this intro probably 10 times already in my car because my son has been screaming inside for almost the last hour now. He's 4 months old. On today's episode, I sat down with Luke Waite, owner of Pomelo Coffee Consulting. Luke works with coffee roasters on how to improve their pricing strategy and operations. Luke is also releasing his new book this summer titled The Owner's Manual, A Guide to Sustaining a Coffee Roaster. As I finish editing the final version of this episode, I'm realizing that some of you are probably coming into this with some pretty low expectations. Unfortunately, there is this narrative within the coffee industry that roasters are making money hand over fist by taking advantage of the farms they buy green coffee from. This narrative started with large corporate brands and has bled into a similar perspective on small specialty coffee roasters like myself. It's a bit draining to see consistent social media posts or articles pushing this narrative, so instead of just automatically assuming the same while listening to this episode, I encourage you to try to hear this one all the way through and learn that sometimes when a coffee roaster becomes more successful, it can mean they can do more good. When a roastery does better financially, this means they have more capital to allocate towards supporting the farms they buy coffee from. It allows them to provide more amenities to their customers and clients, and ultimately gives them the bandwidth to provide a better tasting product that encourages sustainable practices on the farm level and throughout the supply chain. It doesn't always mean selfish financial gain harbored by the owner. So without further delay, let's get right into it.
Could you start just by giving a bit of background about yourself and your company as well?
So my background is in working for roasters. Specifically, I started working in coffee in Chicago, and I was a barista for a while and then moved into education, built some education programs for a couple different companies. I did sales for 2 different companies and then wound up in operations for a roaster in Chicago and realized that that's really where that's where my skills are. That's where my gifting is. And I just really enjoy having access to the levers of making businesses run smoother and helping them make more money. And so when I started doing operations, I realized, this is my contribution to the industry. It's not teaching somebody how to roast or how to brew coffee or, designing a brewer or anything like that. It's how do I help coffee businesses function in a more healthy and sustainable way from a fiscally responsible perspective, but then also from the perspective of how do we make it make sense for the whole ecosystem, and specifically around, how do we responsibly buy green that doesn't burden the roaster, but also provides us a way to purchase green coffee from the same producers year after year and not be price hunters and be folks that work with the same producers year after year. So that was kind of my background. Is like, how do I help coffee roasters maintain their stability and their sustainability while also buying coffee responsibly, and how do we make healthy businesses?
Cool. So you open the book with a distinction between starting and sustaining a roastery. Why do you think so many roasters struggle with making that transition? And what's the first thing that usually breaks when they do?
When you start something, there's audacity and grit and drive, and maybe you take out a loan, maybe you wipe out your 401k to start something, and that's sort of what's required to start your business. That's a reality. The thing doesn't make any money yet, so you have to make some significant investment up front that isn't really practical, isn't backed up by data, and isn't backed up by this will for sure work. You have a business plan maybe, but you don't really know that the thing's going to work. And then over time, you get to a place where that very thinking that helped you start your business, you have to reject it in order to find a place of sustaining your business. And to answer your question around what is the first thing that breaks, I find that typically it's either around your sales or how much you're selling your coffee for. Meaning, because of growth, because of success that you've had, you're selling a lot more coffee and you need more coffee. So you're spending more money, you're making more money, but then you come to a place where you realize, why is there not more money in the bank? And that breaking point is realizing that, maybe I'm not charging enough for what I'm doing, or, perhaps I'm not being as efficient as I need to be, because to this point, I've just been feeding the thing money or my time. I can solve it with more people. I can solve the operational challenge we're having with, I'll just hire another person. And then what ends up happening is you become over leveraged somewhere. And typically it's around either your people that you've hired, i.e., you've hired too many people to solve your operational problems, or you're just not charging enough to make the business sustainable. And it requires that rejection of the very thinking and perspective that allowed you to start your business.
We talked about this for a second, how roasters unknowingly run their business like a charity. Why do you think that the specialty coffee industry in particular has such a strained relationship with profit?
My perspective, and that's the only one I can really have, is the perspective I take. It's that I think there's a lot of really well-meaning people in coffee who have massive hearts, and they don't want to see anybody suffer. And frankly, I'm guilty of this too. I have run my business like a charity in the past as well. But the reality is, and I've shared this with folks, in other spaces, is the reason why every time you get on an airplane, the reason why they tell you to put your mask on before a child or somebody who you're with who maybe can't take care of themselves, you put your mask on first. Don't put theirs on first. Because if you're dead, you're not good to anybody else. If you're not able to breathe, you're not any good to anybody else. And when we think of that from the perspective of a business owner, if you are not alive, you cannot continue to make investments in the social projects you care about. You can't pay your team an equitable amount. You can't pay fair green prices. And so I think it's from this place of people who care a ton about the people throughout the industry and don't want to hurt anybody. And I think it's also a lack of understanding that you deserve to make a profit. You're providing value to your community. And it also is cyclical too. You're providing value up and down the supply circle. So, backwards towards producers and then also forwards to your end consumers. So I think it's a misunderstanding of the actual work and the value that you produce as a coffee roaster and as the owner of a business.
I can imagine that it has something to do with the burnout that roasters feel a few or however long into their business, just because they start to realize that working these 100-hour work weeks are just really not paying off after a while.
It's brutal because you're putting in all this time. You love what you're doing. You care about it. You've sourced coffee intentionally. You're trying to make a difference. And if people are not responding to that, or perhaps they're saying, why is your coffee so dang expensive? It's like, well, I'm not even making any money over here. And so it's like, so to your, I'm sure you can resonate with that. I talk to roasters all the time that for years, they've either not paid themselves anything or are barely scraping by. And it's brutal, man. I think there's also an element too of there's a guy that I really respect. He talks about he does sales coaching and consulting. And he talks about how saying no is very hard when you don't have a lot of opportunity. When you have a lot of opportunity, it's easy to say no. We feel some sort of responsibility of I have to say yes to this because I need to eat. And that's a reality.
Yeah.
But on the flip side of the coin, it's you don't need sales that are not actually making you money. It's actually worse for you.
Yeah. That was a pretty important lesson that I still do try to learn early on because it seems so attractive at first. If it's a high volume client, especially, it's establishing that understanding that it's this is not as good as it seems. The grass is not greener on that side. Yeah. My next question actually is, there's this strong theme that I've read so far in your book about iterative process improvement. So do you have an example of a bad process that you've seen and just how it became great over time?
The last sales role I was in, I was able to increase their close percentage by about 54%. And it's not because I'm a really amazing salesperson that they call it, a rainmaker or what have you. I'm not going to song and dance you. I'm not going to, peddle your wares. The thing that moved the needle there was really just build a process. And I remember it was 13 steps. You build a process, iterate on it. And when I first started, I think it was like 9. And I just kept adding steps, and some of them I got rid of. And the whole way that I was able to increase our close percentage that dramatically was strictly because I just had a process. I followed it. I made it better. And over time, I realized I only need 13 steps. I don't need 14. I don't need 12. I need 13 steps. This is how long it takes to close an account. And there are some adjustments that we made, depending on what type of account we were interacting with, of course. But I think that's the easiest example of a process that was in shambles. We were able to create something that was repeatable, that we iterated on over the long haul, and some pretty direct results of how to increase actually closing an account when you interacted with them.
You suggest that salespeople should try to disqualify leads, not just qualify them. I think that's pretty unusual for people. Why is that mindset shift so important in coffee? Just really quick as a side note, this one was really interesting to me because this reminded me of Charlie Munger's approach to when they would buy into businesses. It's almost like you're looking for the wrong things, or you're looking for things that could go wrong potentially. Mm-hmm. And in doing so, you are actually led to a lot more success because of that. I find it's a lot easier to see things that could go wrong or just kind of quote unquote bad rather than the good things.
100%. Yeah. I think you hit it on the head. There's this book by Daniel Kahneman. It's called Thinking Fast and Slow. And there's this really long acronym that he uses. And I won't be able to get the acronym correctly, but I will be able to share all the words. It's what you see is all there is. And the point is, if you're looking for opportunity from a perspective of how do I make this opportunity work, things are going to be a challenge in the future, whether it be price, or maybe they're a bad fit from a brand perspective, or, maybe you just don't really like the people. Maybe they're not very nice people. Like when you're looking to make something work with a prospect, you're looking to see, how do I make this work? Instead of, what are all the challenges with working with this particular account? And essentially, there's a person I really respect who advocates for this way of thinking, and his name is Blair Enns, and he talks about when you are seeking to qualify upfront versus disqualify, you're deferring all of the possible hurdles that you could have between you and a prospect until the end of the conversation, which at the end of the conversation, that's when an account needs to feel the least amount of friction between you and them. You need to have those friction conversations early on to get over it, to realize, A, this is a bad fit. It's not going to work. I'm sorry. We're going to thank you for having interest in working with us, but I just don't see a fit here. We're going to have to end the conversation here. That saves your salesperson time, or you if you're doing it. It also creates all of the friction up front. And if you're able to get over those hurdles early on, the rest of the conversation with that prospect becomes a lot smoother and a lot easier. And it also communicates to the account that we're going to have hard conversations and then we're going to broach them head on. We're not going to dance around it. And if it's a good fit mutually, it's going to keep getting easier as the conversation goes on, which is exactly what you want in a sales interaction, of reducing friction the longer that conversation goes on. So that's why I advocate for that perspective. And I've seen it work well in my work on the consulting side of things. But then also when I was doing coffee sales, it worked really, really well of confronting the conversations of price early on. Hey, our blenders, our cheapest blender is $12.50 a pound. That could be a problem. If it is, let's find that out right now. Instead of falling in love with them, they falling in love with you, and then 2-3 tastings later, hey, holy cow! I thought your coffee was $6 a pound. It's just not going to work. So it's a time suck, and it's also a relational challenge that really you can't recover from after you go through that.
You're also saving the potential clients time as well in doing that and taking that approach.
100%.
You have obviously strong opinions on training, especially about not overbuilding education programs that customers don't even ask for. Do you believe that the best way to find out what customers want is just through pure volume, or do you believe that there is a better method?
What do you mean by volume? Like interactions or?
Yeah. When I say volume, I guess I mean like, for sales training, for example, right? Like when you were trying to hone in on your sales training program for the roaster that you were working for, do you believe that all of that really just came down to experience, or is there some other thing that you can point to?
Frankly, I built these elaborate training programs that were really, really in depth and super long. The first one I built was like insane. It took me months to build it. And then when I went to, parade it around to the accounts to see if they were, hey, we're now offering training. Would you like to sign your baristas up to it? The only ones they wanted to sign up to were milk steaming and extraction. They didn't really care about where coffee came from, or how is the coffee roasted. There was of course a handful mixed in there, but out of 150 accounts, maybe 2 or 3 were interested in that, and all of the rest of them were interested in milk steaming and extraction, i.e. they wanted to know how to brew coffee and make milk drinks. I would add in there that they also need to know how to clean their equipment, because clean equipment makes delicious coffee. I would try to sneak that into both of those 2 classes so that they understood and knew how to clean their equipment. They just wouldn't know they're taking a cleaning class. It was just part of the milk steaming class or part of the extraction class. But really it was just trial and error and just building. And I built two programs. Every single education program I built got smaller and smaller and smaller, because I realized I was like, this is just a waste of resources to put towards building an education system that they're only going to use 2 of the 7 classes from.
In the cash chapter, you recount a roaster selling at a loss to a flagship account. What are a few overlooked places where cash leaks out quietly of a roasting business?
Labor is a huge one.
Yeah.
And I'm not advocating for not paying your employees, not having an appropriate amount of staff. That's not what I'm advocating for. But there's a lot of labor waste in coffee roasteries. Oftentimes, it's the accounts people and it's the educators and sometimes the salespeople that are really just not producing an equitable amount of value from a monetary perspective for the roaster. What I'm talking about is whenever you have an employee, they have to be bringing in more money than they're costing the business. And when you talk about like education or maybe an accounts person, it's sort of hard to gauge that. The only way you can really gauge that perhaps is through retention, meaning, okay, we lost we had a 30% churn from all of our accounts, before we hired an accounts person, and now it's down to only 20%, whatever that means. So there has to be some type of monetary impact on the business for an employee. And if they don't have it, if they're not producing some type of monetary impact, then it's an oversized weight that it's causing to leak money out of the business. So that's one significant area of waste. I will say, I'm not saying that accounts people are bad or that you shouldn't have them. I'm also not saying you shouldn't have trainers. I'm also not saying you shouldn't have salespeople. The thing that you have to make sure that they're not draining your business is KPIs for each of those roles. And you have clear key performance indicators for what does it mean to be successful in this role. If you're going to be a trainer, we're going to hire a trainer. You're not bringing in new sales. So what are you doing? Well, it's an amenity. It's a value add to our accounts, which means that we then have to have some type of an understanding of, well, how many accounts should you be training every week? How many cuppings should you be setting up for furthering education with other accounts or maybe internal training? What are the things that you're expecting of your team, instead of just hiring those roles just for the fact of, well, the roaster up the street has an educator. In order for us to keep up with them, we better have an educator too, or we better have an accountant. So that's the thing that's the challenge I would push to owners is, what are the KPIs that you're expecting each of those roles to nail every single week. And if they're not able to do that, they're probably wasting you money. So that's a big area is labor. And another significant drain is just like inefficiencies. Meaning inefficiencies in how you're scheduling out your week. Meaning if you can get all of your roasting done in 1 or 2 days, your roaster doesn't need to be turned on, warmed up Monday through Friday. Create some sort of efficiency, whether that's projecting out how much coffee you'll need, maybe roasting a little bit more than you need so that if there's a late order that comes in, but creating some type of structure so that you're not just turning that roaster on every single day and having someone sit right next to it when you're only roasting a couple of batches, on Thursday and Friday or what have you. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. That makes sense. This was one that I highlighted. So obviously this means this is my favorite question that I have. But you talk about roasters needing to understand their power in the green coffee buying relationship. What does it look like for a roaster to wield that power responsibly? And I guess as a side note to that question, I feel like the perspective in the coffee industry that I at least see on social media is that, the roaster always has all this power when determining their pricing and, they're taking advantage of farms. And there's this really seems like a pretty negative view on roasters in general that I've at least seen in these past 2.5 years. So I'm curious to hear your take on this.
I have to ask you, was the last question the one that you cared a lot about or this one?
This one. This is the one.
This one.
Yeah.
Okay.
I care about them all, but this one especially.
It was interesting. I was talking to a processing consultant earlier today, and she was saying something kind of similar. And she was saying there's a misunderstanding sometimes on the perspective of producers that roasters are making all this money. They're selling their coffee for, a couple dollars a pound, and then they look on the shelf and they see a 12-ounce bag for $22. And they're like, oh my gosh, they're making all this money. And there's this misunderstanding of what's actually happening. And the expectation is that roasters are making all this money hand over fist, just pinching the producer. I'm not saying that doesn't happen or hasn't happened. That is a real thing. But the roasters that I work with, 99% of them are happy to make between 6 and 8% net profit annualized. So they're not making money hand over fist. In terms of the conversation around the responsibility that roasters have is to understand that you have more power than you recognize in terms of your approach towards a producer, the access you have to various types of sourcing, whether that be through, I call them conduits, companies like, Algrano, or they're the ones that come to mind, where it's essentially you get to have a conversation with the producer, determine how much you want to spend. And so on this side of the supply circle, we have the most access we've ever had to information, the most access to incredible coffees that we've ever had. And we have to understand that we have power on this side of the supply circle to make really significant choices that can impact people in both directions up and down the supply chain. And that's the responsibility that I'm talking about. I'm not saying that you need to feel bad because you're a roaster and you're on this side of the supply circle. No. Not at all. We need to become sophisticated in our thinking and our process so that we can then utilize that power and understanding to change the way coffee is purchased and to change the way that coffee is moving, because we have tools that we've never had before. I was having a conversation with a friend of mine who he's a bit of a hero of mine. His name's Colin, and he's been in coffee for, 10 or 15 years. And he left SCA and we were just talking about their experience there. And he was like, man, it is crazy to see all of this incredible coffee. He was like, just a few years ago, there just wasn't access to these types of coffees. You walk up and down the aisles and somebody has this crazy co-ferment, somebody has this carbonic maceration, somebody has this, varietal you've never heard of. This was not the way it was even 5 years ago, 6 years ago, 7 years ago. And I think that's really the thing that I'm talking about when I'm talking about power, is that we have to understand that we have a pretty special moment. We have more access than we've ever had in really the history of specialty coffee. Let's wield that power responsibly. Let's be thoughtful about it and not throw up our hands and say, man, it's just too hard to figure out how coffee moves, or to figure out maybe a new or different way to purchase. Maybe there's a way that we can fund producers through microloans. That's one of the things I actually learned recently. Producers do not really have very good access to funding. And the funding terms they have access to are really predatory. So if we have this information now, and if we have access to, we'll call it cheaper money, how can we wield that power to circumvent what's already happening, or the way that we've been buying and selling coffee? And that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about power.
You write also that paying more for green coffee doesn't always mean more money for the producer. How can roasters audit the value chain to ensure their ethics match their actions?
It's a good question. And I think it depends who you work with. On the green side of things, I was speaking with a roaster maybe a month or two ago, and I was asking them about their approach towards sourcing, and they were really seeking to source from female producers or female co-ops, and they wanted to, from a particular part of the world. And I just asked them, I was like, that's amazing. How are you vetting them? They didn't have a good answer for it. And that's okay. This also speaks to the conversation around power. They were saying, I guess I could ask more inquisitive questions of where I'm buying green from. And I said, you definitely should. Just because you maybe buy a bag or a pallet or a couple of pallets or 50 bags from somebody, and you might feel like a small potato, you can ask, hey, I'd love to understand what value you're adding to the supply chain here. And I'd love to understand more about how you function as an importer, because we need importers. That's fundamentally, we need them. Most roasters don't have an import license, so we need importers. We need logistics partners. So I think one of the things is just asking questions and being inquisitive with your suppliers around, hey, this is what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to understand who we source from, and I want to learn a little bit more about your approach. And if they're not able or don't feel comfortable to tell you that information, that's okay. You can find other resources and other sources that will share that information openly. That's really the thing that I'm kind of pushing on there, is just ask the question. It's okay for you to, I have a client right now, they're purchasing coffee from somewhere that's not particularly transparent, and they know that. They're not happy with it, but they're still buying from them for now until they develop relationships with people. Because it takes time. It takes years to develop a sourcing program where you actually kind of understand who's getting paid what. And when I pay $6 a pound, is the majority of this going to the producer? What's happening here? So that's really the thing that I want to empower roasters to, is ask questions of your suppliers. And if you're not satisfied with the answers, there's other places that you can go. And I'm not saying that you necessarily need to run away from everybody that can't give you an answer you're happy with, but just know that you have the power to ask, and that it's okay to ask a question of a producer, of an importer or a supplier, and maybe not be happy with their answer, and you can find somewhere else. I'm happy to make intros all the time. I do. I made an intro earlier today, and I love making intros to green producers.
To just kind of wrap this conversation up, you didn't release your book yet, did you?
Not yet. We're targeting sort of mid-summer, possibly late summer.
Well, if it was released now and every coffee roaster in the world read it, what's one thing that you'd hope they'd change, or at least start doing tomorrow?
Oh, man. I will preface this by saying my perspective is American, because that's where I'm located. That's where 99% of my work is. So that being said, if every roaster in the world implemented a pricing structure, the pricing structure that I advocate for in the book, meaning all of your business expenses in relation to the number of pounds of coffee you sell have to make sense. Meaning, if you do $1 million worth of sales, and you sell 200,000 pounds of coffee, what does it cost to run your business strictly from those two numbers? And then marking up on top of that. If every roaster in the whole world did that, I'd be really happy. And sort of the reason is, historically, the way that folks typically price their coffee is they'll take their cost of goods, the bag, the label, some labor, and then they forget that they have other business expenses, marketing, gas, travel. Those need to be accounted for in your per unit, per pound cost. And then you have to add margin on top of that. So if every roaster in the world took the perspective of that pricing model, I'd be really pumped.
Just Speaking from my own perspective, I can say that it's been very helpful to read your book so far, and I'm excited for when it does release. I actually am very excited to see what kind of effect this will have on the industry, because I think it will be pretty large. Like I said, I haven't been able to find any other book or any sort of real piece of information in general. Unfortunately, there's such a gatekeeping mentality in the coffee industry. So it's really exciting to see something like this. So
thanks so much, Sean.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for doing this. I'm just going to end the recording really quick. Well, before I do, if you want to, do you want to plug your book or anything and talk a little bit more about it?
I mean, it's for sale on my website. Pre-orders are live now. And yeah, I hope it makes a positive impact on the industry. I hope that folks are able to get something good out of it. And yeah,